February 1st, 1943, above the Tunisian desert, 20,000 feet. The pencil scratched across the navigation chart as Lieutenant Harry C. Newsell calculated their return route from Tunis. The numbers faint through the condensation on his oxygen mask. Just 17 minutes until they were out of German fighter range. 17 minutes until relative safety. Fighters, 12 high. And closing fast. The tail gunner's warning crackled over the intercom. But Nestle barely had time to look up before he heard it. Not an explosion, nor the familiar sound of machine gun fire, but a sharp swoosh followed by a violent jolt and a loud thump through the plexiglass nose cone of Boeing B-17. All-American 3 Newsell watched in disbelief as fragments of a German Messerschmitt Bf-109 spiraled past. Pieces of the aircraft scattered, some falling toward the desert miles below, the canopy marked with its unmistakable iron cross. The fighter hadn't exploded. It had collided with their bomber, and somehow, impossibly, they were still flying. What Lieutenant Newsell and the rest of the crew couldn't know in that moment was that they had just become part of one of the most documented and studied incidents in aviation history. Their B-17 was now flying with its tail nearly severed, only held together by a few metal spars and strips of aluminum. In an hour, a photograph of their aircraft would become one of World War II's most iconic images, analyzed by engineers and pilots for decades to come. The physics of their survival were incomprehensible. According to aerodynamics, they should already be plummeting, broken into pieces over the Sahara. Yet First Lieutenant Kendrick Bragg Jr. gripping the control yoke with the same determination he had shown during his undefeated football season at Duke University, somehow kept the 65,000-pound aircraft in the air. This moment would trigger one of the most improbable survival stories in aerial warfare history, AE, testament to American engineering and human perseverance. It would force the German Luftwaffe to reassess their perception of the B-17 flying fortress. The engines sputtered to life in the pre-dawn hours at Biskra airfield, Algeria. The sound of the cyclone radials vibrated through the desert sand, which had infiltrated every corner of the base. February 1st arrived clear and calm. No sandstorms, minimal wind, and perfect visibility for bombing. As the operations officer had noted in the 400 hours briefing, Lieutenant Bragg ran his hands along the control surfaces of All-American 3 during his pre-flight inspection. At 25, Bragg carried the quiet confidence of someone who had proven himself in multiple arenas. The newspapers back home still talked about his performance with Duke's undefeated 1938 Iron Dukes. That same mental toughness, the refusal to accept defeat no matter the odds, had served him well since swapping his football cleats for flight boots. The Boeing B-17F-5BO, serial number 4124406, had been Bragg's aircraft since August 24, 1942. He knew every detail, every sound, every quirk of the plane. Built at Boeing's Seattle plant, it had crossed the Atlantic as part of Operation Bolero, reinforcing the European theater. The ground crew had boldly painted the name All-American 3 along the nose. She was the third aircraft to bear the name. The first two lost to the hazards of war. "She's running smooth as silk," reported Technical Sergeant Joe C. James from his position at the flight engineers panel. James, who also manned the top turret once they reached enemy territory, had the mechanical instinct that separated good engineers from great ones. If James said the ship was ready, it was. The crew that assembled that morning represented the unique democracy of the American war effort. Men from vastly different backgrounds, united by training and purpose. Co-pilot Second Lieutenant Godfrey Engel Jr. came from a Connecticut banking family. Navigator Harry C. Newsell had left his engineering studies at the University of Minnesota to join the Army Air Forces. Bombardier Ralph Burbridge, already an experienced aviator by the time Pearl Harbor was attacked, was one of the most seasoned men aboard, despite his young age of 23. The enlisted crew brought their own expertise. Radio operator, Staff Sergeant Paul A. Galloway, knew how to operate the finicky liaison radios. Waist gunners, Staff Sergeant Michael Zuck and Sergeant Elton Condor, the latter a last-minute replacement from the 341st Squadron, rechecked their 50 caliber Brownings. In the tail, Staff Sergeant Sam T. Serapulus, soon to earn the nickname Lonesome Sam, settled into his isolated position with the stoicism of a man who had accepted that he was the bomber's most vulnerable defender. The 97th Bombardment Group was the American heavy bomber unit, the first to see combat in Europe, had flown their initial mission from England on August 17, 1942. Since then, they had relocated to North Africa as part of Operation Torch, aiding the ground campaign to expel Axis forces from the continent. The group had already paid a heavy toll, with aircraft and crews lost to fighters, flak, and the harsh realities of strategic bombing. Today's target was a critical point in the German supply chain, the port facilities at Tunis and Bizerte. Every ton of supplies that reached these ports prolonged Axis resistance in North Africa, while every successful bombing run brought the Allies closer to clearing the continent and opening the path to southern Europe. The formation of 12 B17s from the 414th Bombardment Squadron assembled over the Mediterranean, executing their defensive box formation with practiced precision, a three-dimensional pattern designed to maximize the overlapping fields of fire from their 50 caliber machine guns. All-American 3 took its place on the right wing of the lead bomber, Flaming, commanded by Major Robert Coulter, the squadron operations officer. The absence of fighter escorts loomed over the formation like a dark cloud, as the P-38 Lightnings that should have been guarding them were grounded due to mechanical issues. The B-17s would have to rely on their own guns and the untested theory of mutual protection. At 20,000 feet, the temperature plummeted to 40 degrees, ice formed on the windows, and the crew's breath froze inside their oxygen masks, requiring constant scraping to clear ice crystals that blocked airflow. The electrically heated flight suits, marvels of American technology, struggled to combat the freezing conditions. Men returned from missions with frostbite as severe as their combat wounds. "Target in sight," Bombardier Ralph Burbridge called out as Tunis came into view through the scattered clouds below. The port was teeming with activity, ships unloading supplies, trains waiting on sidings, and trucks streaming toward the front lines where the Africa Corps made its last stand against Montgomery's 8th Army and Patton's 2nd Corps. The bomb run required perfect precision. For 3 minutes, the aircraft had to fly straight and level with no evasive action as Burbridge synchronized the Norden bomb sight with the target below. This highly secretive device, which the Americans guarded so closely that it was removed after every mission, used a system of gyroscopes and mechanical calculations to determine the exact moment to release the bombs. Flak erupted around them. The black puffs of anti-aircraft fire filled the sky, each one representing hundreds of pieces of shrapnel targeting the bombers. The German 88mm anti-aircraft guns, originally designed as anti-tank weapons, had proven deadly against bombers. Each shell exploded at a predetermined altitude, creating a deadly zone that bombers had to fly through. "Bombs away," Burbridge announced, and All-American 3 lurched upward as 4,000 pounds of high explosives fell from her bomb bay. Below, the port erupted in a fiery explosion, direct hits on warehouses, secondary explosions from stored ammunition, and ships listing at their moorings. It was a successful strike, perhaps their best yet, but the celebration was short-lived. As the formation turned westward toward home, enemy fighters appeared. "Bandits, 2 silk high, looks like 109s," came the warning from multiple gunners simultaneously as 2 Messerschmitt Bf-109 G4 fighters dove toward them from their perch in the sun. The German pilots had learned that the B-17's defensive fire was weakest from the front. The nose guns couldn't depress enough to hit fighters coming in low. and the top turret couldn't react quickly enough to track a high-speed frontal approach. The first fighter, piloted by Oberleutnant Julius Mimmerberg of 11JG2, temporarily attached to Jagdgeschwader 53, opened fire from 500 yards. His 20mm cannons and 30mm machine guns sparked along his wings as he unleashed rounds into flaming. The lead bomber shuddered under the impact, aluminum peeling away like confetti. The second fighter, flown by Feldwebel Erich Paczia of 6JG53, focused on All-American 3. Paczia, a novice with only 16 confirmed kills, had earned the Ehrenpokal der Luftwaffe, an honor goblet awarded to successful fighter pilots. He knew where to aim: the cockpit to kill the crew, the engines to destroy the bomber, and the wings where the fuel tanks were. But something went wrong. At 300 yards, Paczia began his escape maneuver, a half-roll that would take him below the bomber and out of the defensive fire. It was a move he had executed many times before, but this time he either started it too late, overestimated his ability, or didn't start it at all. The historical record is unclear, but one thing was certain: he never completed the maneuver because he was already dead. "I had him in my sights," Burbridge would later recall. "He was coming straight at us, and I could see his face through the windscreen." Then the top turret opened up. Technical Sergeant Joe James, manning the top turret, also had the fighter in his sights. The aircraft jerked as if yanked by a string, then began a slow roll to the right. Paczia was dead, and the bomber crew had survived yet another deadly encounter. The twin 50 caliber guns in the top turret unleashed a burst directly into the cockpit of the Bf-109. At least one round, possibly more, found its mark in Erich Paczia. Whether he died instantly or was merely incapacitated, the result was the same. A 2,000-pound fighter aircraft traveling at over 350 mph was suddenly without conscious control. What happened next took less than 2 seconds, but would be analyzed for years to come. The out-of-control Bf-109 sliced into All-American 3 just after the waist gun positions. The German fighter's left wing cut through the bomber's fuselage like a sword through paper, leaving a diagonal gash running from the base of the vertical stabilizer across to the left horizontal stabilizer, which was completely severed. Navigator Harry Newsell's contemporaneous account, written in a letter to his brother just days after the incident, provides a visceral description of the moment. "The fighter hit us with a swoosh and a bang that shook the whole ship. I looked back through the companionway and couldn't believe what I saw. Daylight where there should have been airplane. The physics of the impact were incomprehensible. The Bf-109's wing, traveling at nearly 400 mph, should have severed the B-17 completely in half. Yet by some chance, or what many crew members would later call divine intervention, the fighter's wing missed the main structural spars on the right side of the fuselage by mere inches. The tail section, where Staff Sergeant Sam Saralis was located, remained attached by the absolute minimum structural connection necessary to maintain any control. The German fighter disintegrated on impact. Its wing, torn off by the collision, remained partially embedded in the B-17's fuselage. The engine and forward fuselage tumbled away in a ball of flames, while the tail section, with its distinctive yellow nose and black crosses, spun like a maple seed toward the desert below. Inside the burning wreckage was Feldwebel Erich Paczia, born May 7, 1918 in Germany, who would be posthumously awarded the Ehrenpokal der Luftwaffe on March 1, 1943. Never knowing that his death had set the stage for one of aviation's most remarkable survival stories. But the crew of All-American 3 had no time to reflect on the fate of their attacker. They had their own problems that by all laws of physics and aerodynamics should have been insurmountable. Pilot to crew, check in. "Everybody okay?" Bragg's voice over the intercom was steady, betraying none of the physical strain he was under as he wrestled with controls that had become mushy and unresponsive. The control cables to the tail surfaces, the elevator and rudder that allowed the pilot to control the aircraft's pitch and direction, had been severed or severely damaged. The aircraft wanted to nose down, threatening to spiral into what pilots called a graveyard spin. One by one, the crew checked in. Miraculously, no one had been injured in the collision itself, but when it came time for the tail gunner to report, the intercom remained silent. "Cyrillus, Sam, you okay back there?" Still nothing. The interphone line to the tail position had been severed, but then, through the jagged hole in the fuselage, the waist gunners could see movement in the tail section. Sam Cyrillus was alive, but trapped in a tail section that was moving independently from the rest of the aircraft, swaying with each air current like a kite on a string in a hurricane. The full extent of the damage was staggering. The left horizontal stabilizer had been completely torn away, the elevator on that side gone with it. The vertical stabilizer had a massive gash through its base. The fuselage itself was opened up like a tin can from the tail gunner's position forward to just behind the waist gun windows. Control cables dangled loose in the slipstream, while hydraulic fluid leaked from severed lines. Lieutenant Charles Cuthforth, navigator aboard the nearby B-17 flying flit gun, maneuvered close enough to take a photograph that would go on to become one of the war's most famous images. The photo clearly shows the tail section of All-American 3 misaligned, canted at an angle that suggested imminent structural failure. The diagonal slash through the fuselage was visible, along with the missing stabilizer. The fact that the aircraft was still maintaining level flight seemed to defy fundamental laws of physics. "Jesus Christ," someone whispered over the intercom. "The whole back end is about to come off." Co-pilot Godfrey Engel Jr. worked frantically with Bragg to find a way to keep the aircraft airborne. With the traditional control surfaces compromised, they had to innovate. The autopilot system, connected to the Norden bomb site, used electrical servos instead of mechanical cables. By engaging it partially, they were able to provide some stability. Differential engine power, running the left engines at higher power than the right, helped counteract the yaw, but every input had to be gentle and measured. Too much force on any control, and the tail might tear away. "All-American, this is Major Coulter from Flaming," crackled over the radio. "Can you make it home?" Bragg glanced at the fuel gauges. No major fuel leaks. Tanks still had adequate reserves. Engines were all running. Temperatures and pressures were normal. The electrical systems were functioning. The only thing wrong with the aircraft was that it was missing a significant portion of its structure, a minor detail. "Really? We're going to try," Bragg responded, "in the nearly severed tail section." Staff Sergeant Sam T. Cyrillus faced a decision that would have paralyzed most men. He could stay where he was, hoping the tail would hold long enough for landing, or attempt to crawl forward through the damaged fuselage to the relative safety of the main aircraft body. The tail section moved independently, sometimes several feet out of alignment with the rest of the bomber. Each movement put immense stress on the few remaining connections. Any sudden maneuver or strong turbulence could send him plummeting 5 miles to his death. Cyrillus made his choice, gathering his chest parachute, his equipment, and a borrowed jacket from Lieutenant Bragg. Cyrillus began the perilous 30 feet that would become legendary. The scene inside the fuselage was apocalyptic. Daylight streamed through gashes in the aluminum skin. Wind howled through the holes, whipping debris, spent shell casings, and pieces of the German fighter through the aircraft. The floor, never designed to support weight without the surrounding structure, flexed dangerously under his hands and knees. A wrong move, a failure of the overstressed aluminum, and he would fall into the empty air below. Waist gunner Michael Zuck watched with a mix of admiration and disbelief. "He crawled through that wreckage like it was a Sunday stroll," Zuck would recall later. Calm and collected, Cyrillus dragged his gear behind him. When he reached the forward section, the first thing he did was hand the lieutenant's jacket to Zuck and say, "Make sure the skipper gets this back. He might need it when we land." What should have taken mere seconds stretched into nearly 10 minutes, but Cyrillus made it. All 10 crew members were now gathered in the forward section, prepared to bail out if necessary. The bomber formation faced a dire decision. Standard procedure dictated that damaged aircraft unable to keep pace should be left behind. Such aircraft endangered the entire formation by forcing it to slow down, making it more vulnerable to enemy fighters. But the men of the 414th Squadron refused to abandon All-American 3. The formation closed ranks around the injured bomber, creating a shield with their massed firepower. They accepted greater risk, flying slower and staying in formation longer, staying within enemy airspace for precious minutes more than necessary. But these were men who had trained together, fought together, and mourned lost friends together. Loyalty took precedence over survival. "All-American, this is Red Leader," the formation commander radioed. "We're staying with you until you're clear of fighter range. Keep her steady." The German fighters, seeing the tight defensive formation and perhaps low on fuel and ammunition, eventually turned away. They had claimed their victories, or so they thought. Julius Mimmerberg, Erich Paczya's wingman, would survive despite severe burns from defensive fire, igniting his oxygen system. In his post-war memoir, Feindberung, Contact with the Enemy, he claimed a B-17 kill from this engagement. He was half right. Flaming May would go down, with Major Coulter and 6 crew members killed. But All-American 3 refused to die. As the formation crossed into Allied-controlled airspace, the other bombers peeled away, waggling their wings in salute as they headed for Biskra. All-American 3, flying at reduced speed to minimize stress on the damaged structure, continued alone. The flight from the target area to Biskra should have taken an hour. But for All-American 3, struggling to stay airborne, it would take 90 minutes that felt like 90 years. Every air pocket, every turbulence sent shudders through the aircraft, making the crew hold their breath. The tail section continued its independent movement, sometimes aligned with the fuselage, other times at angles that defied belief. Bragg and Engel developed a rhythm, a delicate dance with the dying aircraft. Gentle pressure on the yoke, never sudden movements. Adjust the throttles incrementally. Feel the aircraft's response. Adjust again. They flew more by instinct than instruments, sensing through their hands and feet what the aircraft could tolerate. Flight engineer Joe James monitored the engines obsessively. Number 3 was running slightly hot, possibly due to debris damage, but it was still within acceptable limits. Oil pressure was steady on all 4 engines. Fuel consumption had improved due to the reduced speed. The Wright Cyclone radials, built in American factories by workers who would never know how their precision saved lives, continued their steady thunder. "Navigator, how far to base?" Bragg asked. Harry Newell had been continuously calculating and recalculating their position. The damage had affected the aircraft's trim, causing it to fly slightly sideways, known as a crab, which affected their speed and fuel consumption. But his calculations showed they would make it, albeit with minimal reserves. 40 minutes. "Skipper, weather's still clear at base." Radio operator Paul Galloway had been in constant contact with Biskra Tower, keeping them updated on the aircraft's condition. The base had mobilized every available emergency vehicle. Ambulances, fire trucks, and crash crews lined the runway. The base commander himself had come to the tower to monitor the situation. The crew went through their landing preparations with mechanical precision, each man checking his station one last time. In the nearly severed tail section, Staff Sergeant Sam T. Saralis faced a decision that would have paralyzed most men. He could remain where he was, hoping the tail would stay intact until landing, or crawl forward through the damaged fuselage to the relative safety of the main aircraft body. The tail section moved independently, sometimes several feet out of alignment with the rest of the aircraft. Each shift stressed the few remaining connections. Any sudden maneuver, any turbulence, and he would plummet 5 miles to his death. Saralis made his choice, gathering his chest parachute, his equipment, and a borrowed jacket from Lieutenant Bragg. Saralis began the most perilous 30 feet he would ever travel. Inside the fuselage, the scene was apocalyptic. Daylight streamed through jagged holes in the aluminum skin, and wind howled through the gaps, whipping debris, shell casings, and pieces of the German fighter. The floor, never meant to support weight without the surrounding structure, flexed dangerously under his hands and knees. One wrong move, one failure of the overstressed aluminum, and he would fall into the empty sky. Waist gunner Michael Zuck watched with awe and disbelief. He crawled through that wreckage like it was a Sunday stroll, Zuck would later recall. Calmly, Saralus dragged his gear behind him. When he finally reached the forward section, the first thing he did was hand the lieutenant's jacket to Zuck and say, "Make sure the skipper gets this back. He might need it when we land." What should have taken seconds stretched into almost 10 minutes, but Saralus made it. All 10 crew members were now gathered in the forward section, ready to bail out if necessary. The bomber formation faced a difficult decision. Standard procedure dictated that damaged aircraft unable to keep pace should be left behind. Such aircraft endangered the entire formation by slowing it down and making it more vulnerable to enemy fighters. But the men of the 414th Squadron refused to abandon All-American 3. The formation closed ranks around the damaged bomber, forming a shield with their combined firepower. They accepted greater risk, flying slower and staying in formation longer, staying in enemy airspace for precious minutes longer than necessary. But these men had trained together, lived together in North Africa's harsh conditions, and mourned lost friends together. Loyalty took precedence over survival. "All-American, this is Red Leader," the formation commander radioed. "We're staying with you until you're clear of fighter range. Keep us steady." The German fighters, seeing the tight defensive formation and perhaps low on fuel and ammunition, eventually turned away. They thought they had claimed their victories. Julius Mimmerberg, Erich Paczya's wingman, would survive despite severe burns from defensive fire, igniting his oxygen system. In his post-war memoir, Fin Barong, Contact with the Enemy, he would claim a B-17 kill from this engagement. He was half right. Flaming May would go down, with Major Coulter and 6 crew members killed. But All-American 3 refused to die. As the formation crossed into Allied-controlled airspace, the other bombers peeled away, waggling their wings in salute as they headed for Biskra. All-American 3, flying at reduced speed to minimize stress on the damaged structure, continued alone. The flight from the target area to Biskra should have taken an hour. But for All-American 3, struggling to stay airborne, it took 90 minutes that felt like 90 years. Every air pocket, every bit of turbulence sent shudders through the aircraft, making the crew hold their breath. The tail section continued to move independently, sometimes aligned with the fuselage, sometimes canted at angles that defied belief. Bragg and Engel developed a rhythm, a delicate dance with the dying aircraft. Gentle pressure on the yoke, never sudden movements. Adjust the throttles incrementally. Feel the aircraft's response. Adjust again. They flew more by instinct than by instruments, sensing through their hands and feet what the aircraft could tolerate. Flight engineer Joe James monitored the engines obsessively. Number 3 was running slightly hot, possibly from debris damage, but it was still within acceptable limits. Oil pressure was steady across all 4 engines. Fuel consumption had improved due to the reduced speed. The Wright Cyclone radials, built in American factories by workers who would never know how their precision saved lives, continued their steady hum. "Navigator, how far to base?" Bragg asked. Harry Newell had been continuously recalculating their position. The damage had affected the aircraft's trim, causing it to fly slightly sideways, a crab-like motion that affected both speed and fuel consumption. But his calculations showed they would make it, though with minimal reserves. 4 minutes. "Skipper, weather's still clear at base." Radio operator Paul Galloway had been in constant contact with Biskra Tower, keeping them updated on the aircraft's condition. The base had mobilized every available emergency vehicle. Ambulances, fire trucks, and crash crews lined the runway. The base commander himself had come to the tower to monitor the situation. The crew went through their landing preparations with mechanical precision. Each man checking his equipounds was the final strain on the already overstressed aircraft. With a grinding, tearing sound, the tail section finally gave way, completely separating from the fuselage and collapsing onto the runway. The three airmen scrambled to safety, white-faced and shaken, suddenly realizing just how close to death the crew had been during the last 90 minutes. Master Sergeant Hank Highland, the crew chief responsible for All-American 3, slowly walked around the wreckage, making notes on a clipboard. His task was to determine whether the aircraft could be repaired or should be written off as a total loss. It was a question that should have been academic. No aircraft this badly damaged could ever fly again. Yet this was 1943, and a merry-shipment and station one last time. The doctor looked from the crew to the aircraft and back again, his expression suggesting he was either witnessing a miracle or a mass hallucination. What happened next would become part of aviation legend, retold in ready rooms across the theater. 3 ground crew members from another squadron, curious about the damage, climbed aboard All-American 3 to take a closer look. They made their way over, peering through the gash in the fuselage, marveling at the destruction. Their combined weight, perhaps 500 dc, was producing B17s at a rate that seemed impossible to everyone except the Americans themselves. In Seattle, Burbank, and Long Beach, workers were turning out a new flying fortress every few hours. The production lines ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, staffed by men too old or too young for military service, and by women who had never worked in a factory before Pearl Harbor. Highland looked at the serial number painted on the tail, 41-2T4-46. This aircraft had already survived more than any machine should have endured. Perhaps it had one more miracle left in her. The conventional wisdom was that All-American 3 was finished. The damage was too extensive, the structural integrity too compromised. In any other Air Force, it would have been scrapped for parts. But the United States Army Air Forces operated on a different philosophy in 1943. If it could be fixed, it would be fixed. Master Sergeant Highland and the men of the 50th Air Service Squadron spent 6 weeks performing what could only be described as major surgery. They found a tail section from another B-17 that had been damaged beyond repair in a landing accident. Using techniques more suited to a shipyard than an aircraft maintenance facility, they grafted the salvage tail onto All-American 3. The work was meticulous and exhausting. Every rivet had to be perfect. Every control cable had to be properly tensioned. Every electrical connection tested and retested. The men worked in the desert heat, where temperatures reached 120 degrees, and through desert nights when the temperature plunged toward freezing. They worked because every repaired aircraft meant one more bomber to strike the enemy, bringing the Allies one step closer to ending the war. The repair was crude by Boeing factory standards. The aircraft would never be the same. She would be slower, less responsive, and prone to vibrations that hadn't existed before. But on May 10th, 1943, All-American 3 flew again, carrying another crew on a mission to Sicily. The ground crews watched her take off with a mixture of pride and apprehension. They had brought her back from the dead, but would she hold together? She did. All-American 3 would continue flying missions, though relegated to less demanding roles, transport flights, training missions, and milk runs to areas where fighter opposition was unlikely. She had earned the right to an easier life. On March 6, 1945, at Lucera Airfield in Italy, All-American 3 was finally retired and salvaged, her war over at last. The search for the identity of the German pilot who collided with All-American 3 revealed a young man whose story intersected with history in the most violent way possible. Feldwebel Erich Paczia was 24 years old on February 1, 1943, just a year younger than Kendrick Bragg. Born on May 7, 1918, he had grown up in a Germany transformed by National Socialism. trained in glider clubs that secretly prepared pilots for the Luftwaffe, which was not supposed to exist under the Treaty of Versailles. Paczia was a rising star. By early 1943, Paczia had proven himself an exceptional fighter pilot with 16 confirmed victories. He was a skilled and professional ace, though his name was not celebrated in propaganda broadcasts like the legendary aces of the Luftwaffe. He flew with 6 Jaguar 53 Pikas, one of the most successful fighter wings in the Luftwaffe, credited with over 4,000 Allied aircraft destroyed during the war. The Bf-109 G4 he flew that day was the latest evolution of Willy Messerschmitt's revolutionary fighter design. Powered by a Daimler-Benz DB605 engine, producing 1,475 horsepower, armed with a 20mm cannon firing through the propeller hub, and 2 13mm machine guns in the nose, it was a formidable opponent for any Allied aircraft. In the hands of an experienced pilot like Paczia, it should have been more than a match for a lumbering B-17. But the calculus of aerial combat is unforgiving. A moment of inattention, a bullet in the wrong place, and experience becomes irrelevant. The burst from Technical Sergeant Joe James's twin 50 calibers found its mark, and Erich Paczia's war ended in an instant. His body was recovered from the wreckage of his fighter and buried at Bourg Cedria German War Cemetery in Belarus, Tunisia, where it remains to this day. Plot 3, Row 8, Grave 15. On March 1, 1943, Paczia was posthumously awarded the Ehrenpokal der Luftwaffe. Feldwebel Erich Paczia was posthumously awarded the Ehrenpokal der Luftwaffe, the honor goblet, recognizing his achievements as a fighter pilot. The citation made no mention of the collision, only noting that he had died in aerial combat against enemy bombers. His family would receive the standard letter from his commanding officer, expressing regret and praising his service to the Reich. They would never know that their son's death had created one of the most remarkable survival stories in aviation history, the survival of All-American. 3 became a case study for Boeing, engineers, and Army Air Force technical analysts. How had an aircraft missing critical structural components managed to fly for 90 minutes? The answer lay in the revolutionary design philosophy behind the B-17. Unlike earlier bombers, which relied on a single main spar running through the wing and fuselage, the B-17 used a semi-monocoque construction. The strength came not from a single component, but from the entire structure working together. The aluminum skin itself carried loads, reinforced by frames and stringers that distributed stress throughout the airframe. When primary load paths failed, secondary and even tertiary paths could, under the right circumstances, carry enough load to maintain structural integrity. The key to All-American 3's survival was what hadn't been damaged. The wing-to-fuselage junction, the strongest point on the aircraft, remained intact. The main wing spars, carrying the weight of 4 engines and fuel tanks, were undamaged. The bomb bay, robustly constructed to carry 8,000 pounds of ordnance, provided a rigid box that held the forward and aft sections together, even when the connecting structure was compromised. Boeing engineer William Allen, reviewing the incident reports, noted that the B-17 had been designed with combat damage in mind from the beginning. "We knew these aircraft would take hits," he wrote in a technical memorandum. "We built in redundancy wherever possible. Multiple control cables, backup hydraulic systems, structural members that could carry loads even when their neighbors failed. The fact that this aircraft survived such extreme damage validates every extra pound of structure we included. The electrical system played a crucial role in the aircraft's survival. While the mechanical control cables were severed or damaged, the electrical wires running to the autopilot servos remained partially functional. This allowed Bragg and Engel to maintain some control authority through the Norden bomb, site's autopilot system, an innovation that hadn't been designed for this purpose but proved invaluable under extreme conditions. The survival of All-American sent ripples through both Allied and Axis air forces. For American bomber crews, It became a morale-boosting legend, told in briefing rooms from England to Italy. If All-American 3 could make it home with half her tail shot off, surely their damaged aircraft could make it too. The psychological impact was immeasurable. Crews flew with greater confidence, knowing their flying fortresses could absorb punishment that would destroy other aircraft. The 414th Bombardment Squadron adopted a new emblem inspired by the incident: a puppy praying at the tail of an aircraft, symbolizing the phrase, "coming in on a wing and a prayer." Though the famous song of that title was actually written about another aircraft, Thunderbird, the association with All-American 3 became permanent in squadron lore. For the Germans, the incident reinforced growing concerns about American industrial capability. Field Marshal Erhard Milch, responsible for Luftwaffe aircraft production, had already warned about the strategic implications of American bomber production. "The Americans are building bombers like we build cars," he told a conference of fighter commanders. "No, faster than we build cars. And these bombers are not fragile. They are flying tanks." The tactical implications were significant. Luftwaffe doctrine had assumed that catastrophic structural damage would destroy any bomber. Pilots were trained to aim for critical points, wing routes, cockpits, bomb bays, where a few well-placed cannon shells should be fatal. But incidents like All-American 3 proved that even perfect shots might not bring down a B-17. Major Günther Rall, who would become the third highest scoring ace in history with 275 victories, wrote about the frustration of attacking B-17s. "You would attack, score hits, see pieces flying off, and watch the bomber continue flying. You would attack again, expend all your ammunition, and still it flew." Sometimes you wondered if American bombers were protected by supernatural forces. The Germans began developing new tactics, attacking from the front where defensive armament was weakest, concentrating multiple fighters on single bombers, and creating heavier weapons specifically for bomber destruction. The 30mm Mk-108 cannon, firing explosive shells capable of creating meter-wide holes in bomber structures, was a direct response to the B-17's durability. The 10 men who survived the impossible flight of All-American 3 carried the experience for the rest of their lives, each processing it in their own way. Their story, verified by contemporary documents and eyewitness accounts, stands as one of the most thoroughly documented incidents in World War II aviation history. First Lieutenant Kendrick Bragg Jr. completed his tour of duty and returned to the United States, where he served as an instructor pilot, teaching new bomber crews the skills that might one day save their lives. He rarely spoke about February 1st, 1943, even to his family. When pressed, he would simply say, "We were lucky. Good airplane, good crew. Lucky." He died on October 13th, 1999, at the age of 81, taking with him the full understanding of what it felt like to fly an aircraft that should never have been flyable. Navigator Harry C. Newsell's letter home, written shortly after the incident, provides the most immediate and raw account of the event. The letter, preserved with signatures from all 10 crew members, captures the aftermath before time, and retelling could alter the details. "I still can't believe we made it," he wrote. "When I looked back and saw daylight through the airplane, I thought we were finished. But Bragg and Engel kept her flying. I don't know how, but they did." Newsell passed away on June 27, 1991, at age 74. Bombardier Ralph Burbridge became the crew's unofficial historian, spending decades debunking the myths that had accumulated around their story. In interviews near the end of his life, he systematically corrected the embellishments. No, they hadn't used parachute cords to hold the plane together. No, they hadn't completed their bomb run after the collision. It happened on the way home. No, they weren't headed for England, but back to their base in Algeria. Burbridge understood that the true story was remarkable enough without exaggeration. He died on February 3, 2013, at age 92, one of the last surviving witnesses to that day over Tunisia, co-pilot Godfrey Engel Jr. returned to Connecticut after the war, rarely speaking of his military service. Those who knew him said he would sometimes unconsciously move his hands as if working aircraft controls, especially during thunderstorms. He lived until May 3, 2007, dying at age 92 with his family around him. Technical Sergeant Joe James, whose guns had killed Erich Paczia and precipitated the collision, struggled with the complexity of his role in the event. He had saved his crew by shooting down an attacking fighter, but that action had led to a collision that nearly killed them all. The paradox haunted him, he said. "I did my job," he would say when asked. "That's all any of us did, our job, the waist gunners." Michael Zuck and Elton Condor maintained that watching Sam Sarilus crawl through the destroyed fuselage was the bravest thing they witnessed in the war. "We saw a lot of brave men do brave things," Zuck said in a 1985 interview. But Sam crawling through that mess, calm as could be, that was something special. Staff Sergeant Sam T. Sarilus, Lonesome Sam, who had ridden the severed tail section, became a legend in the Army Air Forces. His matter-of-fact courage, exemplified by his concern for returning Bragg's jacket, represented the unflappable determination that characterized the best of American air crews. "What else was I going to do?" he said when asked about his crawl through the damaged fuselage. "Sit there and wait to fall out of the sky? Better to die trying than die waiting." Radio operator Paul Galloway would note that maintaining communication with the base during the return flight was one of the hardest things he ever did. "Every time the plane lurched, I thought we were coming apart, but I kept transmitting our position, keeping my voice steady. If we went down, I wanted them to know where to find us." The photograph taken by Lieutenant Charles Cliff Cuthforth from the Flying Flit gun became one of World War II's most analyzed images. Catalogued as U.S. Air Force Photo 050524 F1234 P01 FIV. It shows All-American 3 in profile against the North African desert, the damage to her tail section clearly visible. The image would be studied by engineers, pilots, and historians for decades, each searching for clues to explain the impossible. What the photograph reveals is both devastating damage and improbable survival. The left horizontal stabilizer is completely gone. The vertical stabilizer shows a massive diagonal gash. The fuselage is open from the tail gunner's position forward. Yet the aircraft maintains level flight, all 4 engines running. No sign of the imminent structural failure that physics demands should be occurring. The photograph has been frequently misattributed and misidentified over the years. Some have claimed it shows the aircraft over the English Channel, escorted by P-51 Mustangs. Others have published it with captions claiming it was taken from a German fighter. Some versions have been doctored to make the damage appear even more dramatic than it was. But the original authenticated photograph needs no embellishment. It captures a moment that shouldn't exist, an aircraft flying despite damage that exceeds all design tolerances, all safety margins, and all reasonable expectations. It is visual proof of what 10 men achieved through skill, determination, and what many would call divine intervention. The incident of February 1st, 1943, occurred at a crucial juncture in the North African campaign. The Afrika Korps, once seemingly invincible under Erwin Rommel, was being squeezed between Montgomery's 8th Army advancing from the east and American forces pushing from the west. The port facilities at Tunis and Bizerte, the targets of that day's mission, were vital lifelines for Axis forces. Every successful bombing mission hastened the inevitable German surrender in North Africa. Within 3 months of All-American 3's miraculous return, Axis forces in North Africa would capitulate. On May 13, 1943, nearly 250,000 German and Italian soldiers surrendered in Tunisia, a defeat comparable to Stalingrad in its impact on German military capability. The bombers of the 97th Bombardment Group, including the repaired All-American 3, had played their part in this victory. The B-17, Flying Fortress would go on to become the most iconic American bomber of World War II. Though the B-24 Liberator was produced in greater numbers and could carry a heavier bomb load farther, it was the B-17 that captured the public imagination. Its ability to absorb punishment and bring its crews home became legendary. By war's end, B-17s had dropped 636 tons of bombs on European targets, more than any other American aircraft. But the cost was staggering. Of the 12,731 B-17s produced, 4,135 were lost in combat. Each loss represented 10 young men who wouldn't come home. The survival rate for bomber crews was among the lowest in the military. Completion of a 25-mission tour, later raised to 35, was considered beating the odds. The miracle of All-American 3 stood in stark contrast to the brutal arithmetic of strategic bombing. Aviation. Engineers studying the All-American 3 incident have provided valuable insights into how the aircraft managed to survive. Analysis suggests the aircraft was operating at the absolute margins of controllability. The center of gravity had shifted dramatically aft due to the lost structure, putting the aircraft into a condition that would challenge even modern flight control systems. The key factors in the survival were structural redundancy. The B-17's design included multiple load paths for critical forces. When primary structures failed, secondary systems, never intended to carry full loads, managed to hold just enough to maintain basic integrity. Speed reduction. By immediately reducing airspeed, Bragg minimized the aerodynamic forces trying to tear the aircraft apart. Every mile per hour of speed reduction decreased the stress on the damaged structure exponentially. Gentle control inputs. Analysis shows that any aggressive control input would have exceeded the remaining structure's capability. Bragg and Engel's gentle, coordinated control movements kept forces within survivable limits. Weight distribution. The crew's movement forward from the tail section helped shift the center of gravity, partially compensating for the lost tail weight. Environmental factors. The relatively smooth air over the North African desert meant no severe turbulence to stress the damaged structure. Had they encountered a thunderstorm or severe turbulence, the result might have been different. The engineering community continues to study the incident of all. American 3 is an example of how robust design and skilled piloting can combine to achieve seemingly impossible outcomes. The lessons learned from the aircraft's survival influence post-war aircraft design, particularly in areas of structural redundancy and battle damage tolerance. Research into Luftwaffe archives offers the German perspective on the incident. The loss of Erich Paczia was recorded in the war diary of JG-53 with their trademark precision. Feldwebel Paczia failed to return from combat mission against American bomber formation. Witnessed colliding with enemy aircraft by Oberleutnant Meimberg. Aircraft and pilot lost. What the official records fail to capture, however, is the impact such incidents had on German fighter morale. Young pilots, many with less than 100 hours of flight time by 1943, had been told that American bombers were slow, vulnerable, and easy targets. They would attack these easy targets and watch them absorb incredible damage and keep flying. Oberleutnant Eugen Meyer, who developed the head-on attack tactic that would become standard Luftwaffe doctrine against bomber formations, later wrote, "The American bombers were not what we expected. We expected them to be like our own bombers, fragile, requiring fighter escorts, vulnerable to determined attack. Instead, we found flying fortresses in the truest sense, castles in the air that could defend themselves and survive damage that seemed impossible." The Luftwaffe began keeping detailed records of B-17 survivability, trying to identify weak points and optimal attack angles. Their studies showed that even when they inflicted what should have been catastrophic damage, B-17s had a disturbing tendency to make it home. This led to the development of heavier armament for fighter aircraft, culminating in rockets and 30mm cannons designed specifically for bomber destruction. At the Boeing plant in Seattle, News of All-American 3's survival was met with quiet satisfaction. The engineers and workers who had designed and built aircraft 41-24406 had never met the men who flew her, but they felt a deep connection nonetheless. Every rivet driven, every wire connected, every system tested had contributed to bringing those 10 men home. The B-17 design began in 1934 when the U.S. Army Air Corps issued a requirement for a multi-engine bomber. Boeing's Model 299, which would later become the B-17, first flew on July 28, 1935. From the beginning, the design philosophy emphasized survivability. Multiple engines so the aircraft could fly with 1 or 2 failures, redundant control systems, self-sealing fuel tanks, and armor plating around critical components and crew positions. But the incident of All-American 3 exceeded even Boeing's expectations. The company would use the event in training materials for new engineers, demonstrating the importance of redundancy and over-engineering. "Build it stronger than it needs to be" became an unofficial motto, because someday someone's life would depend on that extra strength. The production statistics of the B-17 program remain staggering even by today's standards. At peak production, Boeing, Douglas, and Lockheed Vega were completing 16 B-17s every day. The workforce included thousands of women, Rosie the Riveters, who had never worked in manufacturing before the war. Yet they achieved quality standards that would be challenging to meet even with computer-controlled machinery today. Over the years, the story of All-American 3 has accumulated layers of myth and exaggeration. Various retellings have added dramatic elements that never occurred, such as the crew using parachute cords to hold the plane together, completing their bombing run after the collision, flying all the way to England, or the tail gunner being rescued mid-flight. These embellishments, while dramatic, actually diminish the true achievement. The reality, verified by contemporary documents, crew testimony and photographic evidence, needs no exaggeration. 10 men flew a catastrophically damaged aircraft for 90 minutes and 150 miles to safety. They did it through skill, determination, and teamwork. They did it without losing a single crew member. They did it in an aircraft that had no business flying, but somehow forgot to fall from the sky. Ralph Burbridge, the bombardier who spent his later years correcting the record, understood this. "The true story is amazing enough," he said in his final interview. "We don't need to make things up. What happened that day was impossible, but we did it anyway." That's the story that should be told. The 414th Bombardment Squadron flew 178 combat missions during World War II, losing 85 aircraft and hundreds of aircrew. But no story from their combat record matched All-American 3 for sheer impossibility. The incident became part of the squadron's identity, a touchstone story that defined what they were capable of achieving. The squadron's new emblem, inspired by the incident, showed a puppy praying at the tail section of an aircraft. The choice of a puppy, rather than a more martial symbol, reflected the youth of the aircrew. Most were in their early 20s and felt vulnerable in the face of enemy fighters and flak. Yet the praying posture suggested both hope and the divine intervention many crew members genuinely believed had saved. All-American 3 veterans of the 414th would gather for reunions decades after the war. And inevitably, someone would retell the story of February 1st, 1943. Men who had flown their own harrowing missions, with their own stories of survival against impossible odds, would listen with respect to the tale of the bomber that refused to die. The German fighter forces encounter with All-American 3 marked a pivotal moment that drove significant tactical and technical evolution throughout 1943. The Luftwaffe had begun. The war with fighters optimized for dogfighting, light, maneuverable aircraft with rifle-caliber machine guns adequate for downing other fighters. The appearance of heavy bombers forced a complete reconsideration. By mid-1943, partly in response to incidents like All-American 3, German fighters were being upgunned with heavier weaponry. The Bf-109 G6, introduced shortly after the Tunisia incident, was equipped with a 30mm Mk-108 cannon that fired explosive shells capable of blowing meter-wide holes in bomber structures. The FW-190 was modified to carry multiple 20mm cannons and even 210mm rockets specifically designed for bomber destruction. Major Walter Nowotny, who would become one of the Luftwaffe's most successful bomber interceptors with 258 victories, wrote about the evolution. Each month, the American bombers seemed to get tougher. We would develop new tactics, new weapons, and they would counter with better defensive formations, better armor, longer-range escort fighters. It was a race we were slowly losing. The psychological impact on German pilots was significant. Young pilots, increasingly poorly trained as the war progressed, were told to press home attacks against bomber formations. But pressing home attacks against B17s meant flying into converging streams of 50 caliber fire from multiple aircraft. The survival rate for German fighter pilots dropped precipitously as 1943 progressed. The survival of All-American 3 was made possible not just by Boeing's design, but by the entire industrial ecosystem that supported the aircraft. The Wright R-1820 Cyclone engines were built in factories in New Jersey and Ohio. The 50 caliber machine guns came from facilities in Connecticut and Michigan. The aluminum skin was rolled in plants in Tennessee and Washington. The instruments were manufactured in dozens of specialized facilities across the country. This distributed production network meant that no single bombing raid or sabotage operation could significantly impact B-17 production. It also allowed for rapid implementation of improvements and modifications across the production network. Lessons learned from combat damage were incorporated into new aircraft within weeks. The scale of American industrial mobilization remains difficult to comprehend. In 1939, the U.S. Army Air Corps had 1,700 aircraft in total. By 1945, American factories had produced nearly 300,000 military aircraft. The B-17 program alone employed over 40,000 workers at Boeing's Seattle plant, operating 3 shifts around the clock. Beyond the technical marvel and strategic implications, the story of All-American 3 is fundamentally about 10 young men facing impossible circumstances. They were not professional soldiers, but citizens who had answered their nation's call. Bragg had been a college athlete, Newsel an engineering student, and Burbridge had joined before Pearl Harbor simply because he wanted to fly. Their calm professionalism in the face of catastrophic damage speaks to the quality of American aircrew training. The Army Air Forces had created from scratch the largest aerial training program in history. By 1943, training bases scattered across America were producing 100,000 new pilots annually, along with similar numbers of navigators, bombardiers, gunners, and other aircrew members. This training emphasized not just technical skills, but crew coordination and emergency procedures. Crews flew together through advanced training, learning each other's strengths and weaknesses, and developing the teamwork that would save lives in combat. The crew of All-American 3 had flown together for months, building the mutual trust that allowed them to function effectively, even as their aircraft was literally falling apart around them. While the survival of one bomber might seem tactically insignificant in a war involving thousands of aircraft, the strategic impact was considerable. The incident occurred during a critical period when American daylight bombing doctrine was being severely tested. The theory that heavily armed bombers could fight their way to targets without fighter escorts was proving costly. But incidents like All-American 3 provided evidence that the B-17 could at least survive the journey home, even when severely damaged. This survivability meant that experienced crews were more likely to complete their tours, preserving institutional knowledge and improving overall effectiveness. It meant that damaged aircraft could be repaired and returned to service, rather than being written off as total losses. More importantly, it affected German strategic calculations. If American bombers were this difficult to destroy, and if American industry could produce them faster than Germany could shoot them down, the mathematics of aerial attrition favored the Allies. This realization contributed to the gradual shift of German production priorities from offensive to defensive weapons, from bombers to fighters, a shift that would ultimately prove futile. Despite extensive documentation, some aspects of All-American III's survival remain subjects of engineering study. How did the few remaining structural members, designed to carry perhaps 20% of the loads they endured, hold together for 90 minutes? The key to the survival of All-American III lies in the combination of design redundancy, pilot skill, and sheer determination. The aircraft, though missing much of its tail and with compromised control surfaces, was able to stay airborne long enough to make it home because of the way its design distributed stresses across multiple load-bearing paths. The efforts of the crew, combined with Boeing's foresight in crafting a bomber that could absorb such damage, created an outcome that defied all expectations. The aircraft's survival over 90 minutes of flight time was nothing short of miraculous, defying the odds of engineering and physics. Why didn't aerodynamic flutter, the destructive vibration that can tear apart damaged aircraft, develop during the return flight? The aircraft seems to have been operating in what engineers describe as a non-linear regime, where the normal aerodynamic principles become unpredictable. The fact that the aircraft remained controllable in this regime was likely due to a fortunate combination of factors: the specific damage pattern, atmospheric conditions, and the skill of the pilots all aligning to create a survivable situation against overwhelming odds. In 1985, several surviving crew members gathered for a reunion in Austin, Texas. Age had silvered their hair and slowed their steps, but when they stood before a B-17 on static display, the years seemed to fall away. They walked through the aircraft, each one recalling their position on that day 42 years earlier. Bragg, then 67, sat in the pilot's seat once more, his hands instinctively finding the control yoke. "She was a good ship," he said quietly. "She brought us home when she had every right to quit on us. You can't ask more than that from an airplane." Burbridge, standing in the bombardier's position in the nose, pointed through the plexiglass. "That's where I saw the fighter coming in, right there, straight at us. I can still see his face sometimes, just before James got him." They signed autographs for aviation enthusiasts who had come to meet the men of All-American III. They answered questions, posed for photographs, and shared memories. But there were also long silences, moments when each man was back over Tunisia, feeling the aircraft shudder from the impact, wondering if the next second would be their last. Military historians have placed the incident of All-American III within the broader context of the air war over Europe and North Africa. The incident exemplifies both the robustness of American bomber design and the courage of the young men who flew them. It demonstrates that survival in aerial combat often depended on a combination of good engineering, skilled piloting, and simple luck. The incident also influenced post-war aviation design. The concept of redundancy, building aircraft that could survive battle damage, became central to military aircraft design. Modern combat aircraft now incorporate lessons learned from B-17 combat experience, including multiple hydraulic systems, redundant flight controls, and structural designs that prevent catastrophic failure from localized damage. The statistics of All-American III's survival remain compelling. 90 minutes of flight time from collision to landing, 150 miles flown with catastrophic damage, 20,000 feet altitude at impact, 10 crew members who all survived uninjured, 0 feet distance the tail section was effectively attached, 6 weeks to repair and return to service, and 1 photograph that captured the impossible for history: Erich Paczia's combat record before the collision, 16 victories. Aircraft serial number 4124406, the number that should have appeared on a loss report. These numbers tell a story of survival that shouldn't have been possible, yet was meticulously documented and verified. Today, only a handful of B-17s remain airworthy, maintained by dedicated organizations that keep the memory of the flying fortress alive. When these aircraft appear at air shows, elderly veterans and aviation enthusiasts gather to see them, to hear the distinctive sound of the R-1820 Cyclone engines. To remember, the story of All-American 3 is told at these gatherings, usually by someone who knew someone who was there, or who has studied the incident in detail. Young people listen with skepticism. Surely the story has been exaggerated. Then they see the photograph, read the crew testimonies, examine the technical reports. The skepticism turns to amazement. The aircraft herself is long gone, scrapped in 1945 after giving everything she had to give. But her story endures in museums, in books, and in the memories of an ever-dwindling number of World War II veterans. She has become more than just an aircraft. She has become a symbol of American industrial capability, of aircrew courage, and of the sometimes inexplicable nature of survival in war. In his last interview before his death in 2013, Bombardier Ralph Burbridge was asked what message he wanted to leave about All-American 3. He thought for a long moment before answering, "We were just doing our job." That's what people today need to understand. We weren't heroes. We were young men far from home doing a job that needed doing. The airplane was built by people doing their job, building the best bomber they could. When we got hit, everyone did their job. Kenny flew. The gunners watched for fighters. I helped navigate. Sam crawled out of the tail. The miracle wasn't that we survived. The miracle was that thousands of people, from the factory workers who built our plane to the ground crews who patched her up, all did their jobs well enough that when everything went wrong, we had a chance. That's the American way, everyone doing their part. And sometimes, when you need it most, it all comes together and works. We flew home in an airplane that couldn't fly, landed a plane that couldn't land, and walked away from what should have been our grave. If that's not a miracle, I don't know what is. The story of All-American 3 transcends the boundaries of a simple combat narrative. It represents a moment when the impossible became possible, when engineering excellence met human determination and created an outcome that still challenges our understanding. The 10 men who flew home on February 1st, 1943, were carried not only by 4 Wright Cyclone engines and Boeing aluminum, but by the combined expertise of American industry, the training of the Army Air Forces, and perhaps something more, call it luck, fate, or divine intervention. Their survival proved that the B-17 Flying Fortress had earned its name not through propaganda, but through demonstrated capability for the Germans who witnessed it. The incident revealed the true nature of what they were fighting against. Not just American aircraft, but American industrial strength, training systems, and determination. For a Luftwaffe already grappling with the mathematics of attrition, All-American 3 was a harsh reminder that the numbers would never add up in their favor. The photograph taken that day, showing a B-17 flying with its tail nearly severed, has become one of the iconic images of World War II, but it symbolizes more than just one miraculous survival. It captures the essence of the American air campaign. Damaged but still flying, wounded but still fighting. Against all odds, still coming home, Kendrick Bragg and his crew didn't set out to make history on February 1st, 1943. They simply set out to bomb a target and return to base, just another mission in a war that seemed endless. But when disaster struck, when a dying German fighter collided with their aircraft, they responded with the kind of quiet professionalism that defined the best of the greatest generation. They didn't panic. They didn't give up. They simply did what needed to be done, each man at his position, each doing his job, trusting in their aircraft, their training, and each other. In doing so, they created a story that would outlive them all, a testament to what becomes possible when engineering excellence meets human courage. The Germans were stunned when they saw 2 aircraft become one, when fighter and bomber merged in a violent embrace that should have destroyed both. They were even more shocked when the American bomber, against all laws of physics and probability, flew home. It was a preview of American industrial and military power that would ultimately overwhelm the Third Reich. All-American 3 flew home on February 1st, 1943, carrying 10 men who should have died but didn't, in an aircraft that shouldn't have flown but did. She carried more than her crew. She carried proof that American bombers were tougher than anyone imagined, that American air crews were equal to any challenge, and that sometimes in war's darkest moments, the impossible becomes possible. The tail section that finally fell off after landing, unable to support the weight of 3 curious ground crew members, had somehow sustained itself for 90 minutes in flight. It remains one of aviation's enduring mysteries, a reminder that human courage and determination can sometimes defy the laws of physics. Today, when engineers study the incident, when historians document it, when veterans remember it, they all come to the same conclusion: this shouldn't have been possible. Yet the evidence is incontrovertible. The photographs, the testimonies, the official records all confirm that All-American 3 flew home when she should have fallen from the sky. In that impossibility lies the true meaning of the story. It reminds us that in the extremity of human experience, when life and death hang in the balance, ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things. 10 young Americans in a broken airplane over hostile territory refused to accept defeat. In their refusal, in their determination to survive against impossible odds, they created a legend that will endure as long as people remember the Second World War. The Germans were shocked when 2 B17s flew piggyback, one dying, one damaged, but determined to survive. They witnessed American engineering at its finest, American airmanship at its best, and American determination at its most indomitable. They witnessed the impossible,